Emma, is your mom here? That's awesome. You should all you all should have invited your moms. I feel like I would be terrified presenting in front of my mother, but I'm glad you have a better relationship, Emma. Cool. Sarah Klein's here. Great. Let me just wait one more minute to get some more people to join, and then we'll start. All right, we'll just start now. How about that? All right, so our first, welcome to the second LOI panel of the day for the KIDD program. We had a great panel this morning, and now we have another one. So our first presenter is Anna Pearl Johnson, who is a planning, public policy, and management major, and they'll be presenting on Women in Flight, a study of feminist liberation through poetic expression. Please welcome Anna Johnson.
Thank you. All right, let me just share my screen. Okay, are you guys able to see that? What are you guys seeing?
Yes.
Yes, is it in presenter mode or is it?
No, not yet.
Ooh. Okay.
I think you go to slideshow and then say start slideshow. I think that's.
Will it keep my notes?
I think so.
Do that. I'm not seeing okay, maybe that. Oh, it doesn't look like it shows me my notes if I do that. Ooh.
All right, you can just do it regularly then.
Okay, let's try that. All right. Well, the title has changed a little bit, but thank you so much for welcoming me, Brian. Today, I will be presenting on angry, passionate, and dangerous women, feminist liberation through poetry. So essentially, why this topic? So over winter break between starting the third component of the KIDD program, I was thrifting in my hometown and I discovered a book. It did not look like this book. It had a plain blank cover and it was entitled How to Save Your Own Life once I opened the book. And I quickly became enraptured by this book. It was clearly fiction, but at the end there were poems. And so I purchased it for 50 cents and it became my winter break reading material. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the author Erica Jong is kind of world renowned for being very audacious during the 60s. She wrote a book called Fear of Flying that popularized her. And it's a book that really revolutionizes women's desire, specifically sexual desire. But when I read her books, sex wasn't what stood out to me. Instead, it was this ability to have emotional intimacy in ways that I had never really seen expressed on the page. And so for me, I just felt liberated by this. I had a dream actually that I was in her book. And when I woke up, I was like, wow, have I ever actually experienced anger? Have I ever actually experienced passion to the depths that this woman has in the way she writes about it? And so really, I had this moment of clarity and wondering, how do I express my emotions? How do I achieve liberation through expression? And I went out into my living room, told my mom all this, and she was like, what happened to you? Where did this come from? And I told her, I'm reading this book by Erica Jong. And my mom just had this visceral reaction where she was like, oh no. And she had like the opposite of me. So instead of feeling liberated, my mom had this sort of like frustration, dismissal, like couldn't even talk about this author. And so all that led me to wonder, how does liberation take form in poetry, and really what can be considered universal evidence of liberation for women? How does poetry demonstrate the flexibility and versatility of women's strong emotions like rage or passion? And what are the implications of this? So on the left, you'll see my thesis statement for the LOI project. Essentially, in its broadest undertaking, my essay aimed to explore the development of feminist intersectionality, unearthing the works of women who risked expression. So I chose to review poems by Erica Jong, Audre Lorde, and Margaret Atwood. And I argued that poetry is a catalyst for the diverse expression of liberation through equally diverse literary devices. So in order to sort of contextualize my research and narrow down liberation, just because that's a massive topic. I chose to focus my research on sort of the 60s through 80s, which was really the peak of the women's liberation movement in the United States. And really, I wasn't as educated as I thought I was on that topic. I used close readings of prose texts such as the Bitch Manifesto from Joe Friedman's 1968 work. And yeah, it really illuminated the fact that the women's movement was slow to start, and it was not an intersectional movement that encapsulated the unique identities of women. Instead, it was very dominated by sort of this like white, wealthy, straight majority that took hold and propelled the movement forward, but didn't really have the cohesion that recognized unique identities. And so the Bitch Manifesto was an interesting piece to look at because it really demonstrated all of these limitations of the initial women's movement. It's a very crass piece. It kind of lists off all these adjectives that women are traditionally not supposed to be, and then reverses it and says, bitch is beautiful, bitch is aggressive, bitch is dominant. And so while Friedman rooted her argument in the unique, not in the unique experiences of women, but instead this like conformist expectation being broken. So there was an element of resistance, but there wasn't necessarily the development of that resistance. The Bitch Manifesto ends with a strong call to action, ending with, we must organize for our own liberation. We must be strong, we must be militant, we must be dangerous. We must realize that bitch is beautiful and that we have nothing to lose, nothing whatsoever. So in order to further contextualize my research, I looked to newspapers in order to gather a wider response on what poetry was doing in the era. And so I discovered this New York Times article entitled Renaissance in Black Poetry Expresses Anger. And it was written by a white male named Thomas Johnson. He interviewed 3 African-American poets in New York, one of whom was a woman. And it's a really powerful piece. And Nikki Giovanni, the one woman interviewed, is quoted saying, "Knowledge is always available, but we must find a way to dispense it. Black poets are talking about getting basic changes so that they can exist in the society. They are talking about getting something of their own." And literally in the next line of this article, Johnson critiques her celebrated literary publication of the era as a basically angry anthology. So like immediately you see this desire for ownership, this desire for presence, and immediately a rebuttal, this being deemed angry, being deemed something reactionary and almost like punitive. And so in my essay, I explored how Johnson's put down of Giovanni's work was not an accident, but a reaction to the increase of women critiquing power and questioning society's assumptions about women. So from there, section 2 of my LOI covers liberation and anger. So as I mentioned, I focused on anger for a variety of reasons. But poetry during the era of the women's movement provided a spot for this anger to be fueled into, and really gave rise to a field for intersectionality to take hold. So poetry gave home to the quieter cries of women, topics that were seen as complicating the movement's messaging, like how race, class, and status altered people's experiences. Because at this time, the women's movement was still largely led by upper middle class white women, mainstream focus overlooked this anger and this joy being made through diverse women writing poems. So the first poet that I chose to look at, Erica Jong, I had a bit of dissonance about including her or not, because she is someone who came at poetry from a place of great privilege. She's white and fairly wealthy. Although I decided to stick with it just because she was the inspiration of starting this essay in the first place. So I critiqued the first poem that was included in the book that I found, and it's titled Climbing You. Basically likens the trek of understanding a lover's emotions to being a physical trail or a climb. And so in this poem, Jong reclaims the male gaze. So she does this inversion of how men typically viewed women or wrote about women as just being there for like the male's pleasure. She does this with men, over-sexualizing situations and things that otherwise would not be sexual. So there's tons of phallic imagery scattered throughout this poem. There's also an acknowledgement of societal expectations in stanza 3, she directly addresses, I'm supposed to, sort of acknowledging that there is something she's supposed to do. There is a pattern. There's something that is expected of her. And so I do want to note that the place of privilege she held doesn't fully represent the intersectionality that poetry provided the era. But as I was reminded through doing this essay, liberation is not defined as overcoming the most adversity. It's not existing as the most marginalized identity. Instead, it's about breaking the constraints upon you, be it societal expectations, stereotypes, etc. As such, Erica Jong named what constrained her as an individual, specifically sexist societal views on how, when, where, and what a woman can think and feel about sex. And as such, she was a revolutionary, flawed as they all are, but still a heroine nonetheless. And so, as she can be informed by other poets, I next looked at Audre Lorde, and I did her poem Hanging Fire. This is a very different piece published in 1978 that articulates the thoughts of a 14-year-old narrator questioning race, existence, family, and expectations. So here you really see the intersectionality of poetry coming to form. Speaking of form, this is a stream of consciousness poem with strategic and jam at the end of each line that joins together disparate identities. There's also a blurring of past and future, and an acknowledgement of these external and internal familial pressures. Although something that's interesting about this poem is that before the narrator can reach a peak expression of this frustration and anger she feels about existence, each stanza resolves with the enjammed repeated lines, and mama's in the bedroom with the door closed. Literally, this could reference an emotionally uninvolved parent or an absent parent. Figuratively, it may imply a suppressed emotional normalcy for the narrator that spans generations. Either way, the stanzas build in emotional intensity, but never really reach a release. So this led me to question, is this poem important in demonstrating liberation? Does this really acknowledge emotion? And I argued that it did, because Lorde made intentional decisions rooted in expression that resulted in perhaps an unconventional culmination to liberation. It's common to imagine liberation as beginning with questions and ending with answers, but really this poem shows that liberation often ends in answers, or ends in questions, excuse me. Lorde's poem requires readers to consider that things don't always turn out as we expect. As Lorde puts it, why do I have to be the one? And will I live long enough to grow up? Continuing in this study, my next section focused on passion and as a strong emotion that informs liberation. By studying Margaret Atwood, a Canadian poet of the same era, I chose the piece Marrying the Hangman, which is very long, so I did not include it all in this slide. But essentially the piece follows the historical tale of a Canadian woman who was sentenced to death for stealing a pair of gloves. And at the time, this is like early Canada, at the time, for women, in order to get released of their sentences, the only option they had was to marry the hangman or convince the hangman to marry them. For men, they could volunteer to be the hangman. And so in this history, this woman convinced a male prisoner to volunteer as hangman and then marry her. So it's really this dissonance between how to survive in a society that doesn't really give you the same outs as it would a male.
We're at 11 minutes now.
Thank you. Atwood really covered this through these dueling personas, one contemporary, one historic, and did this systematic derangement of chronology, jumping in between past, present, and future. She used repeated symbols and patterns and really showed that liberation and emotional expression can take form in a variety of literary devices. Fundamentally, the piece is about desire, not anger, but a strong passion to live. In the poem for the woman that it is written about, the only way to survive within the society that deems her inferior is to reinvent herself. By extension, all women must face reinvention or a form of societal hanging. So that leads me to my conclusion. Really, what is the conclusion of all of this? There's so many different directions this essay could have taken. There's so much more work to be done on it. This really feels like a chapter of a book that could be written. But really what I discovered is expression of emotion is a necessity. Everyone feels things, but we need to express it. There's this primal energy that fuels us and drives us to put our energy and emotion into creation. There's also no single generalized narrative for liberation. Just as the original women's movement aimed to sort of condense women's experiences into one unified front, we can't do that with poetry. We have to acknowledge that women have unique identities and stories, and likewise their liberation will look unique. And as such, there are many methods of expressing emotions connected to liberation. As theorist Jane Marcus says, anger is not anathema in art, it is a primary source of creative energy. Rage and indignation sear the hearts of female poets and female critics. Out with it. So in my own work, I'm still learning to express. I'm a very empathetic person, and so my poetry often hides or misdirects people from the emotional tone of my piece. But I've really learned that in doing that, I only replicate the patterns of submission that I've learned from society and from my own family, never breaking away from those patterns to name the root of the emotions inside me. And so I'll end with this quote from Audre Lorde. Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. This quote really speaks to the root of my essay. Anger as a method of creativity, as a mode, something that hones your emotion into art as an intentional practice. So when the words of yet another angry female poet crosses before your eyes, I argue and beseech you, please do not dismiss it. We write today in passionate anger so that our daughters might one day write in calm joy. Anger protects us from complacency, passion prevents us from mundanity. Liberation is conditional only on our ability to be honest. So I urge you to be dangerous through radical expression. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Anna. That was great. All right, next up we have Emma Snyder, who is a linguistics major, and their title of their presentation is Confessional Poetry and the Liberation of the Visibly Ill Poet. Please welcome Emma.
All right, give me just a second to share my screen. Get started. Lovely. So slight tweak to my title as well, changing to more of an exploration of the invisibly ill poet, but the main message still stands. This essay has been a kind of a labor of love that I felt was a long time in the making, and then just kind of finally got the opportunity to formulate it. As a writer that writes a lot from a perspective of illness, as an invisibly ill poet, it's been my opinion for a while that poetry can provide such a gorgeous way to catalog your experiences and catalog experiences that really have no other proof of happening. A lot of invisible illness, there's no really external corroboration of what the poet is going through. So they have the words that they manage to make to the page, and that is about the only thing that survives of what they go through. And so it was all of that that really led me to kind of look into what constituted confessional poetry and how poets who wrote about illness did so in that realm. So I'm going to be talking about the origins of the movement. I'm going to be covering a couple of key themes that I saw repeated in the works of invisibly ill poets, and kind of where that leaves those writers. So for the start of looking at the origins of confessional poetry, I do want to acknowledge that it is by no means an easy or cut and dry school of poetry to define, to the point that the critic that originally coined the term, M.L. Rosenthal, later came back and said, I have the quote here, that it was a term both helpful and too limited, and very possibly the conception of a confessional school has done some damage. He had a lot of doubt about bringing that definition to the public and what it turned into. So for the purposes of my paper, I want to follow a definition that was proposed by Stephen K. Hoffman in his article Impersonal Personalism. that looks at confessional poetry less as a school in and of itself and more of a bridge that has allowed to exist between Romanticism and high modernism. There are a lot of roots of romantic poetry in confessionalism, such as the existence of the greater romantic lyric in a lot of poetry. There is something called the crisis autobiography that basically speaks on this moment of philosophical or emotional crisis. And also this being poetry of experience that then later, expands to a broader cultural experience and transcends the poem's specific circumstances. And from high modernism, what it basically takes, this quote here is, while a little lengthy, oh dear, while a little lengthy, I think a pretty good understanding of what it's taking outside of Romanticism is that despite the radical personalism of Wordsworth's The Prelude and virtually the entire Whitman canon, neither poet approaches the minute autobiographical particularity of the confessionals, the almost numbing rehearsal of family conflict, severe emotional imbalance, and the difficulties in everyday living. Neither so consistently or in such copious detail affords us entry into the marriage bed, the asylum, or the detoxification ward. Confessionalism really pulled back the mask of the identity of the poet a lot farther than it had been done at that point. And it sought to really celebrate the everyday existence rather than kind of the hero that we see in a lot of romantic level poetry. So for an example of looking at how romantic elements exist in confessional poetry, I want to look at parts of Lowell's Skunk Hour, which is considered a pretty prototypical confessional poem. So the greater romantic lyric being present with him first setting the scene and then moving on into the crisis autobiography, which can be seen fantastically in this quote here. My mind's not right, a car radio bleats, love, oh careless love. I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell, as if my hands were at its throat. I myself am hell, nobody's here. And in this poetry of experience, this moment of crisis, of sitting in his car and watching the skunks walk by, this is transcending the poet's single day. This is a greater crisis surrounding his work, and that vulnerability is then reflected back to the reader. The simplicity of I myself am hell is still so powerful, and in that moment the reader gets to exist in that moment of just brokenness with the one that wrote it. So moving on to the major themes that can be seen in a lot of the invisible illness poets and the poetry that I found. The first one that I want to cover is the concept of dualism that shows up again and again, which is the mind considered set apart from the body. And this and the mind-body problem have existed far before the confessionalism era took place. There were several different ideas of solutions to this problem posed in Milton and in Trebewitz's article, Body Politics and Paradise Lost. There was kind of a dance between monism and dualism, where Milton proposed that the poet's mind needed and did not need the body in equal measure. This begins to give way to different ideas in the writings of John Wilmot that believed that the body actually should be encouraged to override the mind. And this could also be seen in his work with the way that he allowed acoustics to give way to semantics and meaning to give way to sound. From these, I want to propose a third solution that I believe best fits the poet's works that I pulled today, is that the body is inseparable from the mind, and the distance seen between them is held because of the capability of the body to be the mind's greatest antagonist. So a couple poems that I've pulled that illustrate this are Upon Receiving My Inheritance by William Ferguson. The quote is seen here, where he writes, "Thank you, genetics, for passing this down to me and not my sister. Perfectly healthy. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you, bones. Someday I can't sit up without crying. Some days I can't sit up at all." And also the poem Chronic Illness by Fertesa Latifi, where she writes, "I'm always begging my body to not be so broken, but my body just laughs because it knows who started this war." So throughout the majority of these poems, the poet is writing directly to their illness as if it is an oppressor, and often that oppressor is their physical body. And so it is very internal, to turn inward and kind of split yourself apart as your own enemy. And speaking on the enemy of the body, another thing that is seen very commonly is this idea of an invisible prison that usually takes place in speaking on isolation of being ill. And this isolation can be metaphorical, as seen in the poem Having It Out with Melancholy by Jane Kenyon, which I feel is a really fantastic example of just the experience of chronic illness, starting from her youth, where she writes, "When I was born, you waited behind a pile of linen in the nursery, and when we were alone, you lay down on top of me, pressing the bile of desolation into every pore." She speaks a lot on isolation from peers, seen in these second and third quotes here. And a really interesting and important thing she also covers is the difficulty to believe oneself when a lot of your body feels like it ceases to tell you the objective truth. This is a woman that her entire life is chronicled in this poem, and you would think that there was no way that she would ever have to question her own struggles, but the poem ends with her having a good day, and that's what it takes for her to question what was wrong from this point. Was there anything wrong from this point? And that's such an important thing to cover because it's so necessary to be able to document one's own experiences to prove that you did experience what you did. This isolation can also be very physical from other people, such as in the poem Superstatue by Gail Brandis. And this is Brandis's account of coming back from the hospital from surgery and being separated from her 4-year-old son for several weeks. And throughout the poem, she realizes that her son forgets her name sometimes, forgets what she looks like sometimes. And even now that she's back, things aren't quite the same because she physically can't move the way she used to. And she is the statue in the corner.
We're at 10 minutes, Emma.
Awesome, almost finished. And finally, the last major theme that is seen in a lot of this poem is the concept of taking something very grotesque and trying to find a way to make it beautiful. And a lot of the reasoning for that can be given by something called the organic aesthetic that is proposed by Kimberly Engel Coates when looking at the writings of Wolf and Moron, where basically Coates proposed that the way to most closely know the human experience is to turn inward to the sensations of the body, and something like illness that heightens those sensations brings the poet closer to aesthetic root. So it's a short poem here, but I'm short on time, so I won't read it. But the grotesque to the beautiful is seen really clearly here, especially in this line here, "In the chariot's wheels slice my life in half, from the wound spilled a dead horse and 2 torn wings," and taking that really brutalist imagery and then finding a way to bring beauty to one's own experience. So the question that this essay inevitably left me, and that I will still be working to answer, is why do we write these poems as chronically ill poets? And I think my main 3 answers were that the poet that is living with an invisible illness is pretty constantly facing the inevitability of a body that will fail. And they can face that with fear, they can face that with anger, but it is going to be a decent constant in their life. And with that, they are also experiencing a battle in which they will otherwise remain invisible. And so, what these poems do is provide documentation of their experiences that they otherwise would not be able to share with their peers, and allow them a proof to both themselves and others of the things that they went through and that those things were real. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Emma. Poetry snaps. Great. All right, so next up we have Mia Vance, who's an English major, and Mia will present on Here, There, and Back Again, the Greater Romantic Lyric in Modern Irish Migration Poetics.
Okay, hello. Here comes the requisite moment of figuring out a screen share. In order to preserve my notes, you will also have to bear with this lovely tab at the top of my screen. Can you now see the presentation? It's okay, great. So my notes are here and off we go. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm gonna jump right in. So here we are. And on screen, you should see the title of my LOI, Here, There, and Back Again, the Greater Romantic Lyric in the Poetics of Modern Irish Migration, which is something of a mouthful, right? So don't worry, we're gonna unpack that a little bit before we jump into the poems and my findings later. So first things first, why modern Irish migration specifically? Why not migration poetics in general? Well, I chose to focus on modern Irish migration because I, like millions of people across North America and around the world, have Irish immigrant family history personally dating back to at least as far as the mid-1800s. So the Irish part is important to me. And I came into this study seeking, at least in part, to deepen my understanding of my own immigrant ancestry. But at the same time, the modern migration part is also important, as the natures of immigration and emigration themselves have changed over time. Migration today is not the same permanent dislocation that it necessarily was for my great-great-great-grandparents in the mid-19th century. Economic and technological changes in just the last 100 years have shifted the possibilities of movement from place to place, including everything from brief touristic adventures to study abroad opportunities to long-term or even permanent residencies abroad. So modern Irish migration is significantly interesting to me, not only in terms of my personal family history, but also as an increasingly accessible and real option to consider for my own postgraduate future. So I came into this research to explore potentially how I might one day bring an Irish and American migration experience into my poetry, and vice versa, how I might then bring poetry out of an experience like that for myself. But then why the greater romantic lyric as opposed to other poetic forms or genres? Well, I had never heard of the greater romantic lyric before this year, but as a poet who myself am drawn to place-based poetry and who have been considering the potential of my own future migration, I have been looking for a poetic form that might lend itself to both. As M.H. Abrams defines in his definitive work, Structure and Style in the Greater Romantic Lyric, the GRL is a sustained colloquy which begins with a description of the landscape and which evokes a varied but integral process of memory, thought, anticipation, and feeling, and often rounds upon itself to end where it began, at the outer scene, but with an altered mood and deepened understanding resulting from the intervening meditation. So what does that mean? Well, M.H. Abrams describes these movements of the greater romantic lyric as out, in, out. So beginning and ending in the same external or outer space, but with an intervening meditation or reflection which takes place within the poet or in the poet's inner space. And the idea here is that the meditation and the space are necessarily linked, and that the meditation could not occur separate from the poem setting. But in applying the greater romantic lyric to poetics of modern migration, I've referred to these movements as here, there, and back again, a kind of hero's journey, I guess, in a way. And in this reframing of the GRL structure, there's potential room to be made for both the metaphysical movement of the poet's inner meditation, as well as the actual physical movement of the poet's migration experience, thus reflecting the relationship between place, memory, identity, and movement. So I set out to explore this relationship between the structure of the greater romantic lyric as described by M.H. Abrams and poetry that concerns itself not only with place, but with change of place or migration. And to do this, I chose to focus on the works of Evan Boland, one of Ireland's most renowned and prolific feminist writers, much of whose work in both poetry and prose reflect on her personal migrant experience. So I approached my study with these primary questions in mind. First, how might the greater romantic lyric be seen in the work of the poetics of modern Irish migration? And second, is the greater romantic lyric structure flexible enough to include migration poetics, like those written by Evan Boland? So with those questions in mind, let's take a quick look at some of Boland's poems, and I'll walk you through a little bit of my process of discovery. I chose 3 of Boland's poems. I narrowed it down to 3 from 9 for space, that incorporate aspects of migration to close read in my study. They are City of Shadows, in which the ancient history I learn is not my own, and After a Childhood Away from Ireland. And each of these was selected for their varying degrees of greater romantic lyric-like structure, and because each of the poems themselves seem to make up a kind of a GRL-like arc themselves. City of Shadows revolves around a moment which takes place entirely in Ireland, or here. Ancient History, on the other hand, takes place completely in England, or there. And After a Childhood, moment of coming back again. Unfortunately, I will not have time to show you at length all of the close readings that I did in my paper, but I'll give you a brief overview of the arc of each poem before sharing my findings at the end. Great. And off we go. So we'll start with City of Shadows, which narratively follows its speaker as they walk with their father through the early morning Dublin fog to the Irish seaside, and then returning alone as the fog begins to lift. So the first 2 stanzas place us here, in the middle of Dublin, Ireland, surrounded by its streets and statues, standing at the front gate of Trinity College, where the speaker and their father are preparing for departure. And the next 3 stanzas take us there, as the speaker walks along beside their father's car very slowly, as it moves in dark inches down the only straight route toward the sea, with the implication that the father will be taking the ferry across to England when they get there. And then the speaker comes back again alone as the metaphorical and literal fog begin to lift as they meditate on the concept of leaving and seeming to revisit the original scene of the first 2 stanzas with a new light on their way back. So thematically, the poem navigates through a greater romantic lyric structure, not only physical space as the characters move from setting to setting, but also a complicated emotional space as the magnitude of migration literally dawns on the speaker on their way back again. But the poem does deviate slightly from the classical greater romantic lyric in a couple of ways. First, the emotional resolution comes a little later than in the traditional GRL, where it usually takes place in the middle movement, or the there section. In City of Shadows, Boland withholds this moment until the last couple of lines as the poem draws to a close. And second, while the speaker is definitely still in Dublin, it's not 100% clear whether the speaker returns all the way back to the front gate of Trinity College, as they're still kind of in movement when the end of the poem arrives. But still, we do get the hint, as the images from the opening stanzas come back again in the closing ones, that it's near enough to the original setting as not to cause too much of a problem for the GRL. But the next poem we'll see has a structure that follows the GRL much more faithfully, as we'll see. So that is In Which the Ancient History I Learn Is Not My Own, or Ancient History for short, we'll call it. It begins and ends in a classroom in London where the speaker fixates on a map hanging on a wall and reflects on the physical and spiritual distance between their host country in England and their home country in Ireland. So we begin here with a description of an ancient linen map, fading where it hangs on the wall of the classroom before shifting to there. as the speaker meditates on the distance that seems to grow farther away every year between them and Ireland, and the shift in their identity that takes place as a result. The speaker is expressing here that they no longer feel like an Irish child in England, but because they've been there long enough now and have been educated there for long enough now, they are essentially feeling like an English child at this point, to the extent that their homeland on the map and they themselves, the speaker, no longer recognize each other. So already this poem is starting to bend back again on itself in these middle stanzas. The short sentences of the third stanza and the long, complicated single sentence of the fourth are calling directly back to stanzas 1 and 2. They mirror each other's structure really closely. And the faded blue-green of the Irish Sea in stanza 4 is mirroring the faded stain of empire in stanza 2. So already we've got a bit of the back again in the form itself. And we're already kind of tilting toward that final phase as the voice of the speaker's teacher interrupts the meditation here and gets us to come back again, back to the map on the wall of Ancient History Classroom, London, 1952. So while the speaker of this poem doesn't physically move from place to place like in the previous poem we've seen, they do cover considerable philosophical distance, reflecting not only on how far away they feel from their home country, but how that separation and their education in the host country have already begun to reshape their identity. And even the geology has changed. The land wouldn't recognize itself on this map if it tried. The implication here is that even if one does come back again from such a formative experience, one cannot come back exactly as they were before. So Ancient History is pretty faithful to the GRL structure, the most faithful of the 3 poems that I included in my study, and its deviations are pretty minor. For example, the classic GRL tends to stick to outdoor or natural spaces instead of classrooms, but other than that, the poem really does illustrate how the GRL structure can support the migrant experience in the broadening scope of its physical here and there, and the temporal then and now, and the spiritual distance in between. Okay, so the final example, I'll try and hurry. The final example is the least faithful to the G. All the elements are there, but it's more abstract than the other poems we've looked at. But since it is a poem which itself is addressing the experience of coming back again to Ireland, I couldn't resist including it in the study. So let's get digging. The opening stanzas of After a Childhood Away set the scene here. It's summer, it's dawn, we're on a boat in the middle of the water, an unusually liminal space for the start of a greater romantic lyric, a space between places, between here and there already. And in a way, we're kind of already either on our way there somewhere or on our way back again from somewhere else, depending on your perspective. And to complicate things further, the poem shifts from here to there mid-stanza this time. Here it comes. Then we were there, cove, coming home. So I'll pause on these 3 tiny lines for just a second to let them stand on their own because they are performing some GRL gymnastics. Coming home identifies this as a narrative of coming back again. Home itself denotes the here from which the speaker had moved away in the first place prior to the poem, and then in the meantime, we're left to either assume that the there part is either where the speaker is coming back from, or that by this first line, then we were there, it's implied that maybe the town of Cove has somehow managed to populate all 3 of the GRL spaces at once. I told you it was tricky. Bear with me. So then comes the characteristic inward moment of meditation, or the there section, as the speaker recalls the stories of overjoyed emigrants kissing the land as their ships run aground, but the speaker only stares, claiming to have lost not the land, but the habit of land, the growing out of, settling back on, or being defined by. So even here, the speaker seems to stay in a kind of half-removed liminal space, coming back home to a place they no longer feel they belong to or can be defined by. So what, if not land, does the speaker feel drawn back to? What is home, if not their home country? I climb to your nursery, I stand listening to the dissonances of the summer's day ending, I bend to kiss you, your cheeks are brick pink. So we come back again, not just to Ireland or Cove or the land or the house, but we come back to this nursery and to the lyrical you that has apparently been waiting here all along. So rather than put their lips to kiss the ground as do the immigrants, they bend to kiss this you in the final stanza instead. And there's a comparison here between your cheeks and pink brick, which kind of gives the impression of a sense of shelter inherent in the lyrical you that this person is returning to. So this kind of denotes a person as home or family as home rather than country as home making you, not just Cove, the thing that they are coming back to. So, as we've seen, Childhood Away deviates pretty wildly from the GRL, the classic one. Its here space is unusually liminal. In fact, all three of the GRL movements feel irregularly placed and kind of slurred together, especially there in the middle. And in the end, it definitely does not come back to the same summer dawn in the water from which it began. It's now evening, we're in the nursery, we're on land. But it does take the speaker back again to Ireland after a migrational separation, and it does so with a new definition of home than when they first left in the first place. Great. So that was a lot. Let's take just a quick second to review before we wrap things up. Thank you so much. So we've seen how Boland's migrant poems utilize the greater romantic lyric structure to varying degrees as a framework for the physical, temporal, and emotional movements of her personal migrant experience. And all of this serves to suggest that as a lyrical form grounded in place and which incorporates emotional reflection and processing, the greater romantic lyric is a strong choice for poets in modern Irish migration to use in their explorations of the connections between place, memory, and identity. But is it though? And is it accurate to say that poems like the ones examined here truly are greater romantic lyrics? In the strictest sense, no. One could certainly argue that the parameters of the GRL might be expanded to include urban or interior spaces as well as natural or pastoral ones, flexible enough to allow room for slight rearrangements of the here, there, and back again movements, and even to allow generous room to interpret the meditative middle stage. And to some extent, that's exactly the claim I intended to make in my study. But each of these poems I examined have found their own ways to both follow and to resist the greater romantic lyrics traditional structure. And the needs represented by the deviations from the GRL form in Boland's works, the complicated nature of place, identity, memory, movement, these might arguably migrate too far afield to fit comfortably within the borders of the greater romantic lyric. So in other words, just as Boland and poets like her may have lost the habit of being defined by the land, their poetic work may likewise defy the bounds of pre-established terminology. So I boldly propose, with deepest respect to Mr. M. to describe the GRL adjacent poetic subgenre as explored in this study, the modern migration lyric. Such a term would be applicable to any poem which either, like the GRL, begins and ends in the same physical space, or in its content addresses a return to a previously known space, whether physically, metaphysically, in form, or in memory, and whose intermediary meditation involves a complicated physical, temporal, and or physical distances associated with emigration, as seen in Boland's exemplary works. That is it. We are back again. We did it. That is definitely all the time I have for you today. And thank you once again for sticking with me, lending me your time and attention this afternoon. And with that, I will yield the screen. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Mia. We'll have to hear more about your upcoming move to Ireland in the Q&A. All right, next we have our last presenter, Connor Hardwick, who's the title of the talk is Justifying the Written Word, Medium-Specific Techniques That Can't Be Adapted and What They Are. Please welcome Connor.
Hello, hello. Let me just share my screen at the moment. All right, are you all seeing that very utilitarian PowerPoint? All right, so ignore that for now, because this presentation is actually taking a little bit of a different structure. Just swap to my face if you really want to, because we aren't actually going to address that until the second half of the presentation. You're just stuck in my words for the moment. So I have a confession to make, and it's an embarrassing confession. I'm an English major in the creative writing program, and I don't like reading. I hate it. I have an attention deficit, and books wear me down. Now, it takes me a long time to get through them, and I just get bored easily. It's a me problem. So that didn't used to be the case, because I read all the time when I was a kid, because that was all I had. You know, I moved on to comics and movies and games and what have you once those became easily accessible alternative options. But I've always loved storytelling. I just found other mediums that satisfy that love without the reading part. So I jumped ship pretty quick after that. And that's very counterintuitive to my major. So I got a little frustrated with myself. I had to ask myself why. Why can't I stand reading? And I knew the answer when I asked the question, obviously. I enjoy dense, holistic productions with a lot of disparate elements put together, video and audio and music and acting and cinematography and special effects and prose, just mixed in there. A book is traditionally, at least, a single unimpeded narrative thread from just about near cover to cover. And there are no pretty pictures to entice me along the way, or very few. So I just can't grasp as many layers of appreciation for a book as I can for basically any other medium. But that's what my unfortunate impatient brain demands. It needs that stimulation. So I need to justify reading, right? It clearly needs to be defended because I hate it and I write, so it's my job to defend the medium, right? I'm thinking, how am I going to do that? And the answer is medium specificity. If there's one thing that justifies an artistic medium, at least to me, it's what it can do that other mediums can't, right? That's how cinema carved out an identity. That's what comic studies is about. Video games can do basically anything, so I don't even know why we're having this conversation, but ignore that. Like someone asked me about video games later, if you really care. We'll just pretend they don't exist for the moment. So let's turn that around, right? What can books do specifically that is so unique to the medium? What must be read, not watched, not listened to, must be read to be appreciated. We're not talking conventions here. Books are well protected by conventions. Like movies are expensive to make and they will never cover the ground of a whole book. Like we're never going to have a complete adaptation of Frankenstein at this rate. It's been 100 years. Movies are labor intensive. They need to be paced around a runtime or episode structures if we're moving into television. And there's some stuff that's just too graphic, illegal usually, or just distasteful to actually faithfully film and then be released to a wide market. They're also not going to be 20-hour-long black screens paired with narration, right? That's an audiobook. I don't have a problem with audiobooks. It's just the reading part that I don't like. So audiobooks can pick up the slack then, right? You can just read a book out loud and it's basically the same thing and you get to do something else at the same time, and that's radical. But still, we're talking beyond conventions here, ultimately. I've sort of positioned books like prose-driven, proper big boy books, lots of words, in between film and audio productions. If film can't get the job done, then audio will do the job. They're also both popular mediums that you can enjoy in the comfort of your living room that deliver long-form story a la the novel. So we're picking those. I go into all this a lot more in my proper essay. I collected a bunch of short stories, like some books I've already read too, like Jabberwocky, Lieutenant Gustle, The Wife's Story, Benito Sereno, but we don't really have time for that. So let's just expedite all this and get to the really fun stuff. But first, bullet points. Film is visual, audio production isn't. You can do cool stuff with visual storytelling that's lost in just audio. Audio production, however, can still give you a rich soundscape while delivering a long-form story. And novels have none of these things. Except actually they do. Books are a visual medium. Words are visual. Like, I don't want to get too crazy with you here, but when you're reading a page and you're imagining the story happening, which is in itself a unique style of storytelling that film doesn't really get to enjoy, you're still looking at the page. You're still looking at words. It's visual information. And that is actually our interaction, looking at the page, reading. Because the secret is reading. That's it. There was a secret, but there's no time to build it up. So there it is. The not secret thing that novels have over every other medium is the active process of reading itself. And like, you can read movies, yeah, but I'm talking about full control over your own reading experience, flipping pages and all that. You're the reader, and that relationship can be essential to your experience with the novel in ways that are beyond those other mediums. So here's a question, right? How do you deal with footnotes? How does an audiobook deal with footnotes? How does a film deal with footnotes? There are digressions, branching paths in the prose. Maybe perform the footnote in line in an audiobook, do a cutaway gag in a film. But those are fundamentally linear mediums, and they need to make a decision, which in turn erases that interactive aspect of the text. This is a book from the 80s. The Mezzanine, I have it right here, by Nicholson Baker, that makes liberal use of footnotes. It's about a guy's cascading thought process, if you can see any of that. It's about a guy's cascading thought process that takes place in an instant on an escalator when he's coming back from his lunch break. He goes off in every direction and manages to talk about his entire situation and outlook on life through the power of digressions and footnotes. The narrator actually makes an argument for footnotes, how only they can faithfully represent human thought. You can't do it linearly. Like, thought is more chaotic and sprawling than that. Any given idea has a bedrock of qualifications, justifications, categorizations, exceptions, examples, etc., that are better suited to sprawling out in tentacular paragraphs, and that's his wording. So it's footnotes then. That's what books have over everything else, right? It's deeper than footnotes. So let's skip literally anything else I could talk about and just transition into the main events. Let's move over to the PowerPoint right here. I'll give you a second to switch to that. So, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Dalowski is frankly awesome. It gave me everything I wanted out of this little project. It's basically the centerpiece. There's so much going on with it that I have to limit myself. We'll just talk about, hopefully, we'll just talk about 2 chapters in it. So, a quick overview. It presents itself as a sort of wannabe work of academia about a documentary about a weird house that's bigger on the inside and keeps changing shape. It's a bad house. It's an evil house. In the chapters I'm showing off, an expedition of hardy explorer types head into the depths of the house and they get lost in it. The walls close up behind them and they get closed into this empty labyrinth of shifting hallways and rooms. They spend days descending a giant spiral staircase in the middle of the place, and stuff goes bad. So chapter 9 follows their doomed expedition. So we hit page 119, and we are confronted with something absolutely bizarre, a floating footnote. Okay, well, let's follow it. Let's see what happens. You get right here. Let's read it. Let's read the footnotes as they appear. Goodness gracious. What are we looking at, right? So this floating footnote keeps going. It leads us through the entire rest of the chapter almost. And then we hit a dead end here. It ends. So let's go back. And then we'll continue, right? That's disorienting, isn't it? Well, that's the point. The point is disorientation. But first, take a look at this. This is not a continuation of the footnote. This is the previous footnote, mirrored, inverted. It's bleeding through the page, kind of. So what's going on here on this page, right? Shifting labyrinth. Some guy's getting lost in a labyrinth of a house that keeps changing shape, like all of these footnotes, like all of these different sections of the book. The book is physically representing the labyrinth of the house that they're getting lost in. And if you, let me see if I can do this. You can see this. If you take this section with this floating footnote, you can sort of flip through it and you can look at it like a floor plan of the house and the spiral staircase in the middle. Like, this is the upside down. This is right side up, because, you know, the house has impossible space. It goes upside down, left, right, topsy-turvy, crazy nonsense like that. And all the footnotes in here, they call each other. They go off in weird directions. They're scattered throughout, and also all the reference points. It's like a labyrinth. And here's the kicker. You have to read this. You have to read all of this. So let's read, right? Let's say, all right, here we go. Page 120, footnote 146. Where does that lead us? That leads us to this footnote right here. We're going to go really fast because there's a lot here. All right, so that takes us to this footnote. And then we read 14 pages and it continues every page. And then it tells us to go to 147. Okay, well, where's 147? That's the footnote on the other side of the page, the upside down one. And then you follow that back and you read that back, flipping through the book backwards, reading the book upside down to hit 121. And then that sends you to 148, which is right off to the side here, which tells you to go to Exhibit 1, which is in the appendix, and you have no idea exists when you're reading this at the time. So it's basically just a dead end. And then you go back. So here's another one. Let's get from page 134 to 135. Easy. No, there's a footnote right here. Okay, well that leads us to this tiny little thing on the down here. So let's flip it. Let's follow it back. We're reading backwards again. Okay, 167. That flips. This is where we just were, and now we've flipped here. Now we're reading sideways on the other page, and now we're reading forward again. And the footnote is moving forward, and that tells us to go to 168. And there we are. We're back. We're back in the main text, even if the main text is comprised of a footnote. We did it. That's one page. That's getting through one page of this chapter. The experience is absolutely mind-boggling. Like, you're supposed to get lost, just like the guys are getting lost in the house. But here's a little detail. So we're already comprising the footnote, and the rest of the chapter is going to kind of continue in these footnotes, taking out the main text as opposed to the main text. But we're already in a footnote. So guess what? Here's the secret. Let's go to the top of the chapter. You want to see how it starts? It doesn't. This chapter does not begin. It is encased entirely in a footnote. Encased in these translations, and you can see the translations. Basically, the house is difficult to enter, the house is difficult to exit, and the book is representing the house in this case. House of Leaves, leaves as in pages. The name of the book is that the book is the house. It's bigger on the inside. The cover is shorter than the book. The book is the physical representation of the house, and you are supposed to get lost in it in this chapter. So something interesting here is that this footnote is actually ground to air emergency code. You know, I think it's like a World War II era code. You're supposed to signal pilots up in the air with symbols on the ground. Unable to proceed. It's a little joke, right? What's that?
We're at 13 minutes.
13 minutes. Oh no. Oh no. All right. I'll try to speed up. So unable to proceed. That gets called several times. It keeps telling you to go back to the top of the chapter. No, stop, turn around, you'll get lost, as we've already illustrated. But here's the real kicker, the real kicker. The whole chapter is actually comprised in the next page in this K footnote, which is indicate direction to proceed. This K is only ever called in itself. It is never found outside of itself, and it is the entire rest of the chapter. You have to cheat. You have to break the rules to break into the chapter. The book doesn't want you to read it. It's trying to save you. Like, turn around, go away. And here, later on, there's these X's and another K here, already after that point, telling you to, no, go back, stop reading. And then right at the end, it calls K again. Say, oh, go back. You've trapped yourself. All right, now go back to K, start over again. And the idea is it loops, it's recursive. You're supposed to get trapped, not even just reading it because it's chaotic, but you're supposed to, in reading the footnotes, get lost and loop back into it over and over. So you need to break out of it. And once you do that, you get rewarded with chapter 10. So it's suitable, we're short on time, because so is chapter 10, because it's almost completely blank. It's filled with a bunch of white space. Because this is the second expedition, the house is being a lot nicer. They are physically covering the same ground in a fraction of the time, just like you are in the book. So chapter 9, that's like 45 pages. Chapter 10, that's 92 pages. But this is what chapter 9 looks like, or this is what chapter 10 looks like. And this is what chapter 9 looked like. It took me like 3.5 hours to get through chapter 9, half an hour to get through chapter 10. Oh, we're done. So it's like a reward of dopamine, right? The action is clearer, the narrative is faster, it's linear, easy to understand. The whole reading experience emulates the ease of that second team. And again, it's a reward of dopamine. It's rewarding you for making it through, making it this far into the book. And you just watch like a fifth of the book fly away like that. And that interplay between these two chapters is intrinsically tied to your reading experience. Flip through dozens of pages, frantically try to follow leads that lead to dead ends. And the footnotes themselves are nonsense. Like, they're filled with just lists of nothing. It's nonsense information, just like how there's nothing in the house for hours. And you're flipping through twice as many dozens of pages in the next chapter, filled with quick, satisfying narrative development in a fraction of the time. And that experience is essential to the medium, and only this medium. Like, a confusing movie can reward you with sitting through confusing bits with less confusion, but not like this. This is active and interactive. It's like a puzzle, and you can't adapt this book. I would implore you to try. You can't do it like in a movie or an audiobook. And that is exactly what I was looking for. If you remember what we were talking about at the top of this presentation, I wanted to justify a book. What can a book do? You can't do anything else. That's it. So I saved books. we did it. We saved books from the anti-literary agenda of the modern age. And the answer was not reading, but weird reading like this. And I've gotten a little over time, but that is it. So thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Connor. Glad we could accomplish something in this panel. It's monumental saving reading for everybody. All right, well, I guess I have one question, but first, just for our attendees, you can raise your hand to ask a question or type your question in the Q&A, and then I will just read it out or call on you and have you talk. So please ask our panelists questions, either for everybody or one particular panelist. That will be great. But I guess I'll first start with, and we have about, I think, 15 minutes. But how did your LOI impact your own writing practice? Because this is, if people don't know, maybe it is, a 2-term length project. So you've had a lot of time to sit and think and read. And so how did it impact your own writing practice as you went along? We'll start with Anna.
Good question. I mean, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, I tend to write poems that are purposefully misleading. I tend to blend my different experiences to try to create a cohesive new narrative. And my ultimate goal is like to convince someone that I had that experience, when in reality, each poem is like a creation of mine. It's like a Frankenstein. And so for me, really seeking emotional clarity in all of that has been an interesting practice. And I think what I've developed to do is really select experiences with similar emotional tones, and then use those emotional tones as a method of cohesion to try to create something new. So for me, yeah, it's just been a practice of honesty and really reaching together from a place of honesty to create something deceptive almost, which is a fun combination of things that I find really fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. What about you, Emma?
That's a super interesting question. Yeah. I think partially it gave me the permission that I was looking for to write really strongly about my own experiences and be willing to kind of remove the persona and the little bit of space held between a poet and their work, to the point that it's definitely motivated me to start trying to put together a compilation that is very heavily motivated by ideas of the body and images of the body and how it can metaphorize in nature.
Cool. Looking forward to reading that one day. Mia, what about you? How did your project influence your writing?
Well, first, it was just the best excuse to explode my Irish poetry collection. I spent all of, I was going to say all of my money, but I'm all of winter. I just read as much as I could possibly get my hands on, which was not nearly as much as I wanted. So that was wonderful. It's been great to learn about it. Place-based poetry is part of, I think, what people consider part of the tradition of Irish poetry. The description of the land and the attachment to the land, the embedding of mythology into the geography, I think is a pretty strong tradition. And so it's been validating to explore both culturally an impulse that I personally have, which is to visit a space and write about what comes up in that space. But also to explore the greater romantic lyric form, which kind of reflects that same thing. And all of this under the consideration of what if one day I am a migrant poet myself, going to Ireland and interact, like joining that conversation on the ground. So it's been big, it's been emotional, it's been exciting. And ultimately it's been a gift of giving myself kind of an adapted form of the greater romantic lyric that I can take with me, either here just locally or abroad if I end up getting to go.
And do you plan to migrate to Ireland?
That's the plan. We'll see.
Cool.
I have some very important personal essays to write.
Yes. Wow, that's exciting. Cool. All right. Connor, how did your LOI project affect your writing, which we just formatted in the LOI anthology?
Oh, right. Yeah. So I was actually going to talk about that. I was just going to quickly share my screen just so you could see it. I totally used my my LOI as an excuse to try to do some fun stuff with my writing. So this one story I wrote, I think in the second term, of becoming, the melancholy of becoming one and the joy of becoming another. Sorry, no, I actually switched that around. The joy of becoming one and the melancholy of becoming another. It's a confusing story. It does some cool stuff. So basically, the story is based around the idea of a sublimation of personalities between two narrators that just arbitrarily happens, and they start clashing with each other, and they have to kind of vie for perception, for their own identity, well, crushed up against another identity. And as the story progresses, the narration progresses. Initially, they swap back and forth, and they each have their own fonts. It's subtle, but they start getting confused about things too. So that's all intentional. And then the story starts splitting in the narration, and you can see all this, right? Just like non. Okay, so the narration starts splitting, and both the characters start narrating at the same time, but they actually have difficulty taking in everything at once, like you would if you're reading, because you can't read stuff simultaneously. And it's the same way that they experience life. Like they have to, lose track of themselves while paying attention to the other one. And you can see they're vying for space on the page. One of them beats out the other one. This guy's getting crowded out in his own mind. They start completing each other's sentences, like blending thoughts together, and then they start mixing entirely. They start having the same thoughts, and it's represented visually on the page. They start talking at each other in between the lines, and eventually it gets really noisy, and they lose track of who's who, and their fonts actually change. They switch up. One character thinks he's one character, and the other one thinks he's the other character, and they adopt each other's respective fonts. So the voices are confused, just like you are as you're reading it, by the mechanics of how the story is presented. And then they realize, and now they're sort of one form, like they're turning into one identity. But one of the identities doesn't want this. He wants to escape. He makes a last-ditch effort to split the thoughts, to split the identities one more time. And it doesn't work. You can see here. I represent it visually. Here's one narrator, here's the other narrator, and here's one narrator trying to peel himself off of the other one in the final line. Then it snaps back into place, and now they're one personality. So this, I also talked about this in my LOI. This was like the last 4 pages or something like that. it was a lot of fun to write like that. It took a long time to figure out what I want to do with that. But yeah, that's it.
So you really play with the formatting and making it into an experience and dramatizing that on the page, just like Daniel Liskey.
Yes, absolutely. I actually started writing it before I read House of Leaves because I heard about House of Leaves. I've heard about it for years. I thought, what do I imagine House of Leaves is like? And then I started writing what I imagined House of Leaves could be like. And I started reading, and it was something else completely. But yeah, it was a really interesting experiment, and I'll definitely keep that sort of creative spirit going in the future of my writing. I would say.
Cool. Feel free to put some questions into the Q&A if our audience members have any questions. I guess the other thing I have is what surprised you about in this research process? Like what I always find when I'm researching something, I'm like, you just stumble into something, you're like, holy crap. But yeah, what was surprising that you found in your process? Let's start with you, Anna.
Yeah, so some of the just like the historical context of looking into the women's movement was really fascinating for me. I think when you have like revolutions, you tend to remember the glorious parts and not necessarily sort of like the beginnings of everything. Yeah, I was just very unaware of some of the details. Like they didn't have a mailing address. They were an organization, but they had like no unified messaging, no mailing address for years, while other organizations were arising at the same time that were accomplishing all of those like structural things. Yeah, I don't know, just the interplay of history and how that affected women writers of the time in their quest for liberation and their quest to be heard was something interesting that I didn't anticipate finding as much on as I ended up doing. Yeah, that was something that definitely stood out to me, as well as just some of the reactions to this topic. A lot of my project was just reaching out to people I know and talking to them about this and saying, hey, do you think you've ever expressed anger? Like we all feel it, but have you expressed it? Have you gone all the way and found a fruition to that? So many people said yes, so many people said no, but just hearing the differences and learning how we've come to process our feelings was just a really fascinating practice, and something I definitely will take away with me after this essay is long in the past. Yeah, just being more upfront and honest and hearing and learning about how others are processing these things that we all feel.
Well, and did you talk to your mom again after the initial?
I did. I just had her read it this week, and she, what was her response? She was very proud of me. There was only one part she didn't understand. Yeah, that was her response.
Yeah, get used to it. I think if your family reading your English essays, they might cry or something. But Emma, go ahead. What surprised you about your process?
So a little less surprise, a little more of a very strange coincidence that actually just happened last night. Is I sent my finished essay to one of my oldest writing mentors that I've known very well and I've worked with since early high school, and I learned that he studied very extensively under one of the poets I ended up quoting, Gail Brandis. He knew her very well. He worked with her for 6 months. He'd met her son that got mentioned in the poem. So that was such a strange, surreal moment of small world.
Wow, cool. Yeah, that's a strange coincidence. Mia, go ahead. What surprised you?
I had a similar moment of coincidence. I had a lovely chat with Jerry Doran, who was a student of Evan Boland's before she passed away. And so I was telling her a bit about what I've been working on, and she was like, I was a student of hers. It's a shame that she's no longer with us. And it was a wonderful chat. It was one of the best chats I've had in a long time. But I think what surprised me the most, because the imposter syndrome is real. It's real. I feel like it gets increasingly harder to feel like you're doing research that's going into any kind of new territory anymore. And so I kind of came at this and was constantly second guessing, like, is this the wrong approach? Do these things have actually anything to do with each other? Constantly second guessing. And one of the essay collections that I got a hold of to read in my research for the project was discussing migrant poetics in Irish American writers. And there was a whole essay that focused on place-based poetry specifically for American writers who go to Ireland and start to identify as Irish American or American Irish. And so it was just kind of this wonderfully like validating moment of surprise where I was like, wait, it's the Greater Romantic Lyric. They mentioned it right here in this essay, and they're noting the same essay that I read when I came upon the Greater Romantic Lyric myself. And so it was just like all the dots connected. It felt very empowering and just keep going, it's going to make sense. But then I guess the greatest surprise was to get to the end of the essay and wonder if in fact it really is the term. Is there a term that one needs for that particular type of poetic experience or poetic exploration? And to kind of, I asked my cat permission if I may coin a new term in my paper, and she said it was fine. So I went ahead.
Yeah, Jerry Evan Bowen was actually supposed to come here last year, and so unfortunately, she passed away before she could do that. So that's too bad. But I'm glad she's from wherever she is. She's looking down and excited that you're writing about this. But yeah, imposter syndrome is real. It never goes away, but you get more comfortable with it, I guess. But it's always nice to see, okay, I'm tracking this conversation correctly. I'm entering it in a way that makes sense. So that's a comforting thing to realize. Connor, what surprised you about your project?
House of Leaves. Just reading House of Leaves. This is a monstrous book. Like, look at this. I never bookmark anything when I read, but this thing has flipping back and forth over hundreds of pages to decipher the thing. It's absolutely incredible. But an actual really interesting thing when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do my LOI on was that people don't really think about this. Like in my brief research into just the initial stuff of, hey, what are the medium specific things that books do? People don't talk about that. I found like people are always talking about what can film do, what can music do, what can video games do, what can all these other mediums do that sets them apart from books, because books are like the standard. Like books are perpetual, they will always be there, they never need to be justified, whatever, they're books. Why are you thinking about this? This is weird. And the only time I ever actually saw anyone talking about, whoa, there's some crazy stuff that books can do, it's only ever in response to these specific big successful crazy books. House of Leaves, I know Infinite Jest is another one, but those are really, it's a very low number of texts that actually apply to this subject when thinking of it in terms of medium specificity. That was the weirdest part, that no one thinks of this. And I thought about it because I'm not a fan of reading. And that was a unique direction to take the LOI. I'd say
that's always a good thing to ask. I mean, I think I've read some defenses of the novel, because many people are like feeling under siege. Many authors are like, no one's reading us anymore. And they always come back to like exploration of consciousness and but also the sort of reading experience you're talking about. And a lot of theorists actually like to write about Daniel Liskey's The House of Leaves, because it is this sort of thing that rewards rereading and puzzling and is more of a immersive sort of hypertext experience. There's actually some great criticism about the systems of the book. If you want to, I can suggest a critic for you that I saw present on the book. But he actually came to Ohio University when I was a student there, and there was just like people like you sitting on the floor of the classroom being like, you're a genius, God, please tell us how you did this. And so he's like I think a really cult figure that I'm glad to see that continue on the enthusiasm for his books. So
I wish I found that stuff in the process of researching. This is like my first foray into the topic. I'll just read House of Leaves for the LOI, and it took the whole research process. Like the whole time I had to research was reading the book.
Before you have people's ideas in your head. That's a good thing. But yeah, I'll send you an email about that particular theorist, because she's pretty smart. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for presenting, and a lot of really interesting takes. And I hope you can join us in 20 minutes when we have our last LOI panel of the day. But thank you so much to all our presenters. Poetry snaps for all of you. All right, thank you so much. Bye.